Now, we have, and we're very fortunate to have, a very distinguished and a very knowledgeable person about marine history this evening to speak to us, the guest speaker. Dr. Lewis Fisher kindly agreed to come along to speak to us, and he had to rush down over the Burin Peninsula Highway and come in over the Trans-Canada to get here, and I'm glad that he was able to make it. Dr. Fisher is a professor of maritime history at Memorial University. He's a specialist in maritime history, and he's written extensively on merchant shipping, maritime labor, and maritime economics. He is currently Secretary General of the International Commission for Maritime History and Secretary of the Canadian Nautical Research Society. Now, when I looked down and I saw that he was Editor-in-Chief of the International Journal of Maritime History and the Northern Mariner, I had to stop, because Wayne told me when they asked me to speak to the people here this evening, he said, we got Dr. Fisher from the university is going to speak to us. He knows you. And I couldn't remember. I said, well, if he said he knows me, we must have met on some occasion. So when I saw the Northern Mariner, I said, cripes, I've got a copy of Northern Mariner. I don't know if it was Dr. Fisher who gave me it. So anyway, I hunted it up among my books and I had a glance at it, and it was a 1991 edition. So anyway, Skip, as he's called by his friends, is presently working on a study on the maritime history of Western Europe, the history since 1700, and he's working on that study for Oxford University Press. Now, I take it a great privilege this evening to have been able to tell you a little bit about Dr. Fisher, and I want to invite him now to address us, and make him welcome, please.
Thank you, Morrissey. Later on, I'll tell you where we met, and I'll tell you how you got the Northern Mariner, too. But I'm not. One of the things I didn't do tonight was bring anything advertising any of our publications, and I did that intentionally because I didn't want in any way to detract from what I think is a very important occasion here. Let me just flesh out a little bit of what Morrissey said. Higher education in Newfoundland at the end of the 20th century is not what it used to be, and the reason that Morrissey alluded to me coming down up from the Burin Peninsula, I was down teaching in Burin today. I left at 4 this morning. I got back at 7:30 tonight. So if I fall asleep before you do tonight, I hope you'll at least understand why. I also need to tell you that I'm not a specialist in Newfoundland maritime history. However, I do know a little bit about it, and I'd like to share a little bit with you tonight. Basically, what I want to do is two things. First of all, I want to try and put the history of Newfoundland coasting into some sort of national and international perspective. In doing this, I want to make it clear that this is one of the most important activities that people engage in. But I'd like to talk to you very briefly about some of the kinds of sources that you might use to study the history of coasting. I want to be honest with you right at the start. Studying coastal shipping anywhere in the world is probably the most difficult kind of shipping to study. On the other hand, shipping is the most documented industry in the world. And we've got good records, or reasonably good records at least, which will enable you to answer a lot of questions about some of these vessels. And indeed, had I known what the Society's brochure looked like, I would have been glad to, in fact, bring the registries for those vessels, because I know where to put my hands on them. And we could have settled the question, Morrissey, of just how long these vessels were, and we could have traced its history as well. I'll show you some of that in a second. Now, because you're recording this, this presents a problem. Number one, I hate to stand still. Number two, I'm going to have to take a little walk over to the overhead projector, and I suspect that that's going to mess things up a little bit. I apologize for that, but it is necessary for me to show people this. We're also, Peter Bugden, who did a lot of work for me today while I was off dealing with students on the Burin Peninsula. Peter is passing out some samples of documents. I want to apologize for the quality of these. Another problem that we had today was that our Xerox machine gave up the ghost, and hence some of these documents are not going to be as readable. But I will show you these things on overhead as well and talk a little bit about the kinds of information you can get from them. And I'd like to thank you, Peter, for all the work that you did today. All right, first of all, coasting as a trade. In Newfoundland, right from the time that the first people came, obviously this was a maritime society. I mean, there's no question about it. People came here to exploit those fish stocks on the Grand Banks and in the coastal waters off of Newfoundland. We know that. What people frequently miss, however, is just how important ships and shipping were to this society and how important they remained. Let me give you a couple of pieces of evidence to show you just how important this was. The first piece of evidence requires me to use a little bit of jargon, and I apologize for this. There's a statistic called a correlation, and a correlation is simply the measure of the strength between two or more variables. In other words, it asks the question, if you spend $10 on this, will you get $10 back over here? You know? It wants to see what the kind of relationship is. A colleague of mine and I did a study about 15 years ago of investment in shipping in Newfoundland. We covered the period from 1820 to 1936. And over that entire period, we ran a correlation between the population of Newfoundland and investment in shipping. And we used tonnage, a measure of carrying capacity, as a surrogate for investment in shipping. Now, these correlation coefficients, these magic little statistics that I mentioned, a perfect relationship is plus 1.0, and it never happens anywhere in the world. It happens in statistics classes, but it doesn't happen in the real world. When we correlated, see the relationship between population and shipping in Newfoundland, over almost a century and a half, the correlation coefficient we came up with is plus 0.99. When I saw that, when the computer told me that that was a correlation coefficient, I immediately doubted what we'd done. I thought we must have made a mistake, and so we did it again. We didn't make a mistake. Since then, we've done similar kinds of studies all over the world, and we've never found a society in which investment in shipping and population were so important. Now, as Newfoundlanders, we know what most of this investment in shipping was. We have to be careful here about romanticizing our past. I think our past is worth celebrating without romanticizing, without exaggerating. Most of the vessels that people invested in Newfoundland served two purposes. That is, they were inputs into the fishery, allowed people to catch the livelihood that throughout the 19th century always employed more than 80% of all Newfoundlanders. And they used it for coasting. Because of the importance of the fishery to Newfoundland, we know an awful lot more about those vessels that were using the fishery than we do about the coasters. And that's why this society, it seems to me, is so important, and why I'm so happy and honored to have been asked to come along tonight. I think this is a society that deserves everybody's support. So people invested in these vessels. Do you know, Newfoundland vessels were not like the vessels, for example, that were built in the 19th century in the Maritimes during the so-called golden age of sail. Morrissey alluded to some of the relationships between the Maritimes and Newfoundland. In the Maritimes, they built lots of 3- and 4-masted sailing vessels. They rigged them as barks and full-rigged ships, and you see pictures of them all the time. They're really majestic creations. They're, I think, one of the most exciting creations in the history of this part of the world, or indeed any part of the world. They're a beautiful, well-built sailing ship really is a work of art, as well as an economic tool. Newfoundland vessels, whether we built them here or whether we imported them, are an entirely different stock. Now, we had more vessels in the 19th and 20th century than all the maritime provinces put together. I mean, Newfoundland had lots and lots of vessels, but they shared a similar characteristic. Most of them were small. This is true whether they were used in the fishery. It's true whether they were used in coasting. And it's true if they were used in what Morrissey talked about before, the international trade. If I told you the size in the 19th century of some of these brigantines that carried fish to Spain, or down to the West Indies, or down to Brazil, you wouldn't believe me. I mean, a lot of these vessels are under 30 tons carrying capacity, less than 50 feet long, manned by only 4 or 5 men, including the master. Somehow they managed to do this. In the whole history of Newfoundland shipping up to 1936, and I picked 1936 because one of the sources that enables us to study Newfoundland shipping is complete only through 1936, and I'll explain this in just a second when I show you this particular source. And our whole history up to 1936, Newfoundland had a grand total of only 11 vessels on registry in this province of over 500 tons. Most of our vessels were small vessels. During the age of sail, they were mostly rigged as schooners, sometimes as brigantines, particularly in the seal fishery before the introduction of steam. Sometimes some of the smaller vessels only had one mast and they were rigged as sloops or ketches. But if you're looking for these transatlantic barks, the sort of trucks of the transatlantic trade in the 19th century, you won't find very many of them. And you won't find a single full-rigged ship ever registered in Newfoundland. Another problem, and I think, let me make this point a little bit more clearly perhaps. One of the things to keep in mind about this is that one of the difficulties that we've had in trying to interest people in studying Newfoundland's maritime heritage is the fact that so many of these vessels were small. You do this in the Maritimes, and the Maritimes right now, they've got a crazy scheme, which hopefully won't work out. A group of people in New Brunswick want to build a replica, and I'll admit my bias, I'm not a big fan of replicas. They want to build a replica of a vessel called the Marco Polo, which for a while held, some of you may know her, for a while she held the North Atlantic speed record, which is a piece of trivia that you can instantly forget. No particular value of the vessel, there's nothing particularly unique about it, except that it was a full-rigged ship. And people are interested. People find full-rigged ships romantic. The Newfoundland vessels, however, were working vessels. They weren't vessels particularly that you wanted to admire and say, my, how beautiful, although for some of them that's certainly true. Essentially, they were working vessels. They're proletarian vessels, if you will. I mean, people put more effort into using them than they did into designing them. Another problem that we've had historically in getting people interested in studying Newfoundland vessels, and I don't want to get in a fight with Morrissey about this, but it is true, is that most of the vessels, at least up until the interwar period, weren't built here. They were imported from Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, but even more likely from Prince Edward Island. Prince Edward Islanders sold over 90% of the vessels that they built in the 19th century, and about 70% of the vessels they sold ended up in Newfoundland. They were the ones, for example, who supplied most of these brigantines in the pre-steam seal fishery. Again, this is a problem. If you take a look at the Newfoundland shipping registers and you add them up, or you use the computer to sort them out, see where these vessels were built, so many of them were built elsewhere. People can't, for the most part, say, oh yeah, I know this vessel was built in my community. Now, especially in the interwar period and after World War II, this changes. But for the most part, most of these vessels weren't built anywhere. The other problem, too, is that the vessels that were built in Newfoundland, for the most part, were built simply hauled up on a beach somewhere. That is, if you're interested in industrial archaeology, there aren't all that many shipyards that you can go to and say, oh yeah, these vessels were built here. Morrissey alluded to some, but for the most part, it's a craftsman in a small community somewhere along the coast who built this, usually with just a few boys or a few family members or friends helping him. All right, so you can't find an infrastructure to study. All of these things, I think, have mitigated against the study of Newfoundland shipping. But above all, in most societies, the coaster has been about as far from a romantic object as it's possible to be. In the study that I'm doing right now on British coastal shipping, A friend of mine put together a bibliography, which we published, and I'd be more than happy to provide copies of this if you want to see what's been done about coasters elsewhere. He put together a bibliography of all of the things that have been written about the British coastal shipping industry in the last 100 years. The total came to less than 300 books and articles, and that's not very much, considering that in terms of numbers, the British coastal fleet was immense. By the end of the 19th century, there were about 14,000 vessels going around the coast of Britain. And yet almost nobody studied them. It's because they carry cargoes which are not as romantic as say those three-masted ships that we can talk about. I mean, these coastal vessels didn't carry tea from China, and they didn't carry silk from the Orient, and they didn't carry exotic fruits from the Caribbean or from the Mediterranean. As Morrissey said, they carried the produce of this region of the world. Important produce that made this society what it is, but still not produce which is designed to make your blood rush much faster. Lumber and fish oil and seals. The output of this society. In Britain, they carried cargoes like China clay. China clay trade is the second biggest coastal trade in Britain in the 19th century, behind only coal. But try getting, I've got a student doing a thesis now on the China clay trade in Britain. It took me a while to get him excited in that, believe me. China clay, who cares about that as a cargo? Let me study a cargo that's interesting, he said. But we hooked him on China clay in the end anyway. And so that's another problem in terms of interesting people in getting involved. Nonetheless, if they do, they'll find that they're looking at an industry without which this society couldn't have survived, and which shaped this society, which in very important ways made Newfoundland what it is. All right, so that's a little bit of a context to put it into. Now, I mentioned that it's tough to study the coasting trade. It is because an awful lot of the records that pertain to the coasting trade, records that exist for the foreign trade, have simply been destroyed for the coasting trade. Nonetheless, if you throw up your hands and say there were no records, you'd be making a big mistake, because there's lots of records. And I'd like to show you some of these records. Now, the records I'm going to show you tonight are just a sampling of what exists in the Maritime History Archive at the university. Some of you I know have been in the archive, but those of you who haven't, let me tell you a little bit about it before I show you some of the sources. First of all, I'll tell you it's the second largest archive in the entire country, and by far the largest maritime archive in the world. Now let me tell you how big it is to give you some idea about this. Our records in the archive comprise about 8.5 linear miles of documents. Our most important records, and I'm going to show you an example of these in a while, the so-called crew lists. When we got those in the mid-1970s, they accounted for about 25% of the shelf space in the Public Record Office in the United Kingdom, which is the world's largest archive. So 8.5 miles of records. Okay? It's a remarkable resource. The only archive that's bigger in this country is the National Archives of Canada. I mean, this archive is bigger than the provincial archives of Newfoundland and Labrador, the provincial archives in Ontario or in Victoria. It's a huge archive. It has a number of records which are unique, which are copies from elsewhere. I mean, we have, for example, the only complete set of Lloyds anywhere in North America. We have all of the British colonial shipping registries, whether they're Canadian, Australian, Indian, it doesn't matter. We've got them all. But the backbone are these crew agreements, which I'll show you in a second. They take up most of that space. We also have a lot of mercantile history of Newfoundland companies, a variety of things, and we can certainly explore some of those things later on if you'd like. Now, Peter, again, I apologize for one. Peter gave you some documents. Again, I apologize for the quality of those things. If you take that off, I'd be glad to carry it with you.
No, I just put it here in front.
Okay, that would be helpful. What I'm going to do is show you some overheads in some of these documents. Okay, and again, I apologize for the quality. If you come and visit us in the archive, however, I can assure you that most of what you see there is in fact readable. And you can use it to answer questions like how large a vessel was, for example. All right, this document that I've put up and that you have a copy of is a registry. Now, under British law, and remember Newfoundland had to deal with British law, or we were bound by British law for most of our history, and indeed Canadian law after Confederation. It's just a pale copy of British maritime law. Under British law, beginning in 1786, all vessels 15 tons or over that were decked had to be registered. For Newfoundland, every one of those registries has survived in one form or another. In other words, if a vessel was registered in Newfoundland any time since 1787, when the 1786 law went into effect, this registry survived and we got it. This is true up to 1936. That's that magic date I mentioned before. Canadian law today says that when all of the vessels in a registry book are closed, these have to be deposited with the National Archives of Canada. In the case of Newfoundland, there are some vessels registered in 1937 for which the registries are not formally closed by the Registrar of Shipping here in St. John's. This doesn't necessarily mean that they're still in operation, but it means that the registrar, for whatever reason, simply hasn't got reliable enough information to close the registry. So we don't have those registries, but they're available to you down in the Sir Humphrey Gilbert building if you want to have a look at it. Okay? So we can document every vessel registered in Newfoundland for more than 200 years. And here's an example of one of these vessels. In this case, you're going to have to help me, Peter, here, since you did the copying. Where have we got the registry here? Is this the registry? Yeah, the Kyle. This is the Kyle, of course you know. I'm having trouble because this is backwards. If you got this stapled, this one should be on the front. Okay. You can see some of the information that you can get about this vessel. First of all, and this really matters. On the top, you see this thing called official number right by my finger here. The official number is sort of like a car license plate. It's assigned by the registrar at the time the vessel's first registered, and it's the number that you can use to link to a whole variety of other sources, including crew agreements, as you'll see in a second. All right? So that's a unique identifying number. No other vessel in the entire British Empire has that number except the Kyle. All right? 133532. You can see something about its registration. It's registered here in St. John's, Newfoundland, and it's number 114 in 1913. All right? You can also see that this is not a new vessel. The Kyle was not new when Newfoundland got it. It had been registered before. It was registered as number 14 in 1913 at Newcastle. That's Newcastle on Tyne in the United Kingdom, where in fact the vessel was built. You can see the particulars about this vessel. You can see its gross tonnage here, which is 860 tons, but that's under the tonnage deck. You can see all the deductions and additions that are made. Its total gross tonnage here is 1,055 tons. You can also see its deductions allowed under British maritime law, and then finally its registered tonnage, 545 tons. Okay? And the deductions are itemized over here on the right, if you want to take a look at it. Let me go through this a little bit more quickly. You get information on the owners, and in this case you can see it was the Reed Newfoundland Company, all right, who were the owners, and they had the entire vessel, I think. I'm trying to read, since I don't know very much about Mr. Gillespie, who's listed here. Yeah, he's just acting for the company. All right. So Reed owns 64 out of 64 shares. All vessels in the British Empire divided into 64 shares. Okay? So 64 64ths means they own the entire vessel. Now, you also get information here on these registries. What you can see down here in this area, these are called transactions, and they're not all readable, at least in this copy. But you can see some of the kinds of information that you get. I mean, if you really look, Peter and I just did this before, you can read most of these, despite what might appear. But if you take a look down here, one of the things you find about the Kyle is that it was mortgaged. In fact, all of these up here are mortgages. But this one you can read. This one on the 6th of August, 1923, the Royal Trust Company is discharging its mortgage. That is, the Reed Company had mortgaged the vessel, and this vessel in 1923, 10 years after it's first registered in Newfoundland, the mortgage is being discharged. Down here, you can read this one, transaction number 5, the Reed Newfoundland Company Limited, on the 6th of August, 1923, by a bill of sale, sold the vessel to the Minister of Finance and Customs of the government of Newfoundland. In other words, the government of Newfoundland bought this vessel from Reed in 1923. Then 36 years later, here's one of Morrissey's older vessels, 36 years later, in 1959, the government of Newfoundland sells the vessel to the Arctic Shipping Limited Company of Halifax, Nova Scotia. All right, so you could trace down all the transactions, and indeed, had there been more than 6, there would have been a reference to where you could have gone to find the others. If a vessel is mortgaged, if somebody sells even 1 or 2 shares, it's noted on these registries. So you can trace what happens to a vessel. You can also find out what happens to the vessel in the end. In this case, the registry in Newfoundland was closed, and you can read it, because the vessel was transferred to the port of Halifax, not surprisingly, given that Arctic Shipping Limited, in fact, the Halifax concern, on the 10th day of December 1959. All right, so the vessel at that point goes off of Newfoundland registry. We could then, if we wanted to, trace it through Halifax registry if we want to find out what finally happened to it. All right? The point here is that there's a lot of information that you can get. Let me just show you the other side of this so that you can see how we can answer Morrissey's question, for example, about the size of a vessel if we wanted to. Up here, we're getting all of the information about the Kyle. In this case, we're told that it has 2 decks, it has 2 masts. Again, this is an auxiliary steamer, at least in the first instance. It's got 2 decks, 2 masts, it's schooner rigged. We can find out about the shape of the stern, and it's clinker builds in this case. It has no galleries, no figurehead. It's a steel vessel. It's got 5 bulkheads, and on you go. And over here on the side here, we get the dimensions. So the Kyle is 220 feet long, for example. It's 34 and a half feet. 230. Yeah, that's the length for the weather deck. That's 237 and a half. Its width is 32 and 3/10 feet. Its depth is 15 and 3/10 feet. Okay, so you can find out precisely about the vessel. Also, if this vessel were ever modified significantly, there'd be a reference on the registry to when it was modified and what its new dimensions are. In other words, you can learn just about everything that you want to know about the vessel through these registries. Most of what we have, most of the Newfoundland registries are available in the Maritime History Archive on microfilm. The originals of these registries, if you don't like microfilm, the originals, one set of originals exists in the Public Record Office in Kew, in the Board of Trade Series 107 and 108. So you can actually go and handle them if you want. The other originals are in, because there were 2 sets of originals here, the other originals are in the National Archives of Canada in Ottawa. But we have a complete run on microfilm, so you can find them all here. And even better, if you're interested in older coasters before 1936, we have every one of these on computer. And you can go into the archive, or you can phone the archive, and you can give them the name of the vessel or some distinguishing characteristic, and they will search the vessel for you. If you want to know, for example, all the coasters that were owned by Reed, or all the coasters that were owned by any particular shipping company, you could, in fact, ask the archive to do that search for you. Because it's on computer already, it's no particular problem to do. So the shipping registries are one of the building blocks. There's no need here to guess, necessarily, or to rely on our memory about how long a vessel was or what its measurements were. You can find out. And we're more than happy to help you find out. Well, before everybody gets too antsy here, let me show you the second set of records here. And these are called, as you can see on the top, the agreements and accounts of crew. Now, you'll notice that this one is for a foreign-going ship, and it's also the Kyle. All right, I'll say something about it in a second. These agreements and accounts of crew. The British government, from the early 1860s onward, was very interested in knowing about its ships and seamen. Not only those ships and seamen in Britain itself, but throughout the entire empire. And so they came up with the idea of these crew lists. And what these crew lists were documents which were required by law to be filled out by all by the master of all vessels that were engaged either in the foreign trade or the coastal trade anywhere in the British Empire. They had to be, they collected, as you'll see in a second, information about the crew. They tell you something about the voyage. And as I said, they were required by law both to be filled out and to be deposited with the Registrar General of Shipping and Seamen in Cardiff. The problem for those of us who are interested in coasters is this, that vessels that coasted in North America in particular fell through a crack in imperial legislation. The clear intention of the regulations were that these things should be retained. But sometimes intentions and practice are two different things. And in fact, what happened in the case of most of the North American coasters, this is true for Canadian as well as Newfoundland vessels, is that they were destroyed. They simply never made it back to the Registrar General of Shipping and Seamen. However, we do have some coasters, and particularly, and again, this relates back to something that Morrissey said, particularly because of that anomaly, that fact that until 1949, a vessel trading across the Straits of Belle Isle or into the Gulf, in fact, was engaged in legally the foreign trade. And so in this case, we can pick up the Kyle, which is engaged, as you can see in this case, on a voyage, go up here to show you, on a voyage from Port aux Basques to North Sydney. Now, when a crew was recruited, one of the first things that they would have looked at was this crew agreement, because it tells them something about the terms of employment that they can expect. In this case, they're told that they sign on this vessel. All right, they're going to make a trip from Port aux Basques to North Sydney. But then look what it says. It says from thence to and from places in the Dominion of Canada and Newfoundland for a period of 6 calendar months. Final port of discharge to be Port aux Basques, Newfoundland. Now this is about as restricted as one of these crew lists ever gets. Vessel doesn't have to only engage in trade between Port aux Basques and North Sydney. It can go to any place in Newfoundland or in the Dominion of Canada. If you think about it, it in fact could go down through the Panama Canal and end up trading with Victoria, British Columbia. In this case, it doesn't do it. But an awful lot of these crew lists will say things like, especially for foreign-going vessels, it'll say something like from Liverpool to Malta for orders, and then to any place in the world between 75 degrees north and 75 degrees south, for a period not to exceed 6 years. You sign on to one of those, you can go anywhere. Right? But in this case, you sort of know what you're doing. Now note, before I take you inside here and show you something about the crew served on the Kyle in this voyage, we got the name of the Kyle, the name of the vessel, so we can find the Kyle either by name, and we have an index to this. You can find it by name, or there's that official number. And in fact, we have very good indices that show us every vessel's by official number, whether we have a document for any year from 1860 until 1959. Our crew list collection ends in 1959. All right, you can see it's registered in St. John's. You can see its registry here in 1913. Basic information, it's owned by the Reed Newfoundland Company. You can also see that the vessel has certified accommodations for 32 people. Of particular interest to most of the people who signed on, though, is two things. First of all, where the vessel is going to go, and secondly, how many people they have to share the work with. And that's specified on here. In this case, at least 7 of these people are engaged as sailors, which means in this case ABs. All right? So at least 7 of these people have to be able-bodied seamen. And that gives the prospective seaman an idea about how many men there are to share the work with. Let me take you inside. I mean, you can look at these things to your heart's content. The second page on your document is not all that interesting. It's not all that interesting because it's pretty standard. It shows you, for example, what the scale of provisions were on the Kyle. This simply adheres to British maritime law, and in this case, there's nothing crossed out or added in. And hence, once you've seen one of these, I hate to say this as a historian, but once you've seen one of these, you've seen them all. Okay? If in fact there were some changes made, if there were substitutes, then it's sort of interesting. But in this case, there was none, so there's not much to say. To me, what's really interesting about these crew agreements, though, well, there's nothing on page 3 particularly, is there? Let me take you to page 4. is that they're wonderful documents for social history. Now, I apologize about this. One of the unfortunate things here is that in order to copy these, we had to split the pages. If we opened up one of these crew agreements, they're sort of like a book. If we opened them up, you'd see that, that this page, page 4 and page 5, actually face each other. But unfortunately, they don't here. All right, we can find out about the people who were on the vessel. You can see the captain up at the top. In this case, it's Captain Stevenson. But you can see all the other people who were on there, too. Now, here's where it gets, for me, real tricky, because I can't see their... let's see if I can do this. I don't know if I can or not. It doesn't make sense. If I can line these up. What I wanted to look at here is the occupations. I don't know if I can line these up very well. I can't do it as well as I'd like to. All right, but you can see an awful lot of information about each of these people. You get their name, and please note that these guys signed their names, all right? Which means that they're also nice documents if you're interested in things like literacy. And in fact, some of these people are signing with X's. You look, here's a guy who signs with an X, here's another one who signs with an X, here's one who signs with an X as well. So you get some sense about whether or not they're literate. You get their age. You can see the mates up there. Mr. Brenton is 36 years of age. There's a 60-year-old seaman. He's the second mate, I guess. The bosun, Mr. Carter, is 37. You can see what the age profile is. You can see where they're from. Not surprisingly, most of these people are either from Channel or from Port-au-Basque, which is sort of what you'd expect given what this vessel is trading in. But you can see there are some people from St. John's there. Here's one from Grand Bay, and not very far from Port-au-Basque. It's not exactly an international crew, but on a lot of the deep-sea vessels, of course, that's exactly what it is. You get information then about their age, about their birthplace, about their residence, about the last ship that they served on. In the case of the Kyle, and this is not typical of most Newfoundland coasters, by the way. In the case of the Kyle, almost everybody, the last vessel they served on was the Kyle. This is the vessel that retained its crew, but an awful lot of Newfoundland coasters didn't. Crews quite frequently were switched. Now let me just take down to the next page here. We've got information here, of course, on their occupations, and again, I'm sorry that I had to slice that. You can also see what they were paid. Now, one of the things you might notice, I mean, pay is, to point this out here, it's column 12, I think, in this case, or is that column 12 yet? Master's pay is left blank. There's an awful lot of master mariners here, so I mean, I'm not going to embarrass them by asking questions about pay, but this is true for about 99% of the crew agreements. The master's pay is simply not specified on the crew agreement. But you can see what the others got. You can see, for example, that the mate got $125 per month, the second mate $95 a month, the bosun $70 a month, the purser $110 a month, the chief engineer $165.60 a month. Here's a piece of trivia for you. Almost every place in the world, about the turn of the century, the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, you began to see unionization in maritime ranks. Almost every country, the protagonists for unionization were not the able-bodied seamen or the ordinary seamen, as you might think, but rather the mates. If you look at what happens to the mates, particularly the introduction of steam, you can see why. For most of the 19th century, mates are the second highest paid people on these vessels, paid only below the master. But here, and you can see by the early 1920s, the mate's making considerably less than the chief engineer. A chief engineer, of course, has a set of skills that are very necessary for the operation of the vessel. But obviously, the mate's status, as reflected in his pay, declines relatively, if not absolutely, over time. And so it's not too hard to understand why mates are among the more restive of people. You can see that the second engineer gets $127.28 a month, the third engineer $107.64. The oilers all get $67 a month, the firemen, a job that I wouldn't want to do, $65 a month. The trimmer, there's one trimmer on here, you see down here, $55 a month, and then down to the ABs. If there's such a thing as maritime de-skilling, certainly happening to the ABs on steamers. On steamers, ABs would not have been paid in the range that they are on sailing vessels. They wouldn't have been paid as low as they are on steamers. Now, I'm going to, for the interest of time here, just let me make a couple of general points about the crew agreements. If this were a deep sea vessel, British maritime law would have required the master, every time he entered a foreign port, to deposit these records, and they would have been stamped by either the shipping master or the British consul in that port. What that means is that for deep sea vessels, these documents are also wonderful ways of tracing the voyage patterns. For coasters, the law again was more vague. And on most of the coastal agreements, the vessels never were stamped. But on the back of these documents, there's a page, sometimes 3 or 4 pages, which in fact allow the master to fill in the day and the time that a vessel enters port and the time that it leaves it. Now, this is not quite as precise as what the shipping master would have done, but still, it allows this for many coastal vessels, although apparently not for the Kyle in this instance, to trace its voyage patterns over time. About the only thing that you can't learn about the operation of a vessel from these crew agreements, about the only thing you can't learn is about its cargo. Again, the British, when they designed these documents, weren't interested in cargoes. They were interested in ships and men. And as a result, almost none of these vessels will tell you what they're carrying. Although, again, once you know the pair of ports it's trading between, you can usually figure it out. And indeed, there are other documents which will help you to understand the cargoes that vessels carry. But the crew agreements won't do that for you, okay? Or at least not as a general rule. Now, there's one final document that I just sort of like to show you. I mentioned that we have a complete set of Lloyds, and lots of times we get people who come into the archive, and the first thing that they ask for is Lloyds, because they've heard of Lloyds. There's an even better source for a lot of the questions that people have, particularly about coasting vessels. And this is something called the Mercantile Navy List. Now again, we have the most complete set of Mercantile Navy lists anywhere in North America. And we thought that you might like to see the information that you could get about the Kyle, since we've been talking about the Kyle here. You can see there are several Kyles in here, but ours, you can tell by the official number there, that's 133-532. Is that the number? Right down here. Okay. You can see its international code signal is given. That was also, by the way, given on the registry, if anybody wants to know what it is. It's Port of Registry, St. John's, Newfoundland, 1913. Again, you can see that it was built in Newcastle on Tyne in 1913. It's a steel vessel. Again, its dimensions are all in there, 220 feet, 32 and 3/10, 18 and 3/10. And finally, over here, you've got information about the owner, the Reed Newfoundland Company of St. John's, Newfoundland. These are alphabetical. They're easy to use. As I said, we've got an almost complete setup. And you can use these to track just about any vessel that you want. They're in many ways superior to Lloyd's. We also have, and just let me mention a couple of sources that I think that some people sometimes find useful. We have Lloyd's Captain's Registers. We also have the Registrar General of Shipping and Seamen's Captain's Registers. We have all of the records of colonial mates who passed, mates and masters who passed the mates and masters exams. All of the records of colonial individuals who passed the engineer's certificates. We have a variety of different shipwreck databases, both national and local, that you can plug into, and a number of backup resources. In short, it's possible for you to find an awful lot about the vessels that you're interested in. As you can see, it's also possible for you to find out an awful lot about the men who sailed it. Now, I don't want to mislead you. Most Newfoundland coastal vessels, as I said before, we don't have crew agreements for. But we do have registries. We do have registries. And sometimes we have the crew agreements, or using other sources, you can find out what a vessel did. So what I'd like to do is encourage you to use the Maritime History Archive. It's open to the public Monday through Friday from 9 until 5. It's also open on Tuesday and Thursday nights. from 7 until 9:30. I've got some brochures up here about the Maritime History Archive, and in fact, rather than leave it to chance, Peter, why don't you throw a few of these around? And if anybody would like to use the archives, or would like some help, would like to talk about sources, you can certainly contact the archivist, Heather Wareham, or any of her staff. And if you think that I can help, I've got my business card up here. Feel free to take a copy of my business card. You can phone me, fax me, write me, email me, anything you want, and I'm glad to help in any way I can. I want to reiterate, as a professional historian, how important I think the work that this society set out to do is. And I want to pledge the cooperation of Memorial with my colleagues in the Maritime History Archive and Maritime Studies Research Unit in any way that we can help at all. Thank you very much. If you want, Wayne, if anybody has any questions, I'll be glad to deal with them. You want to do that, or do you want to just... I don't know if I can help in any way, and I know it's getting late, so... But if anybody does have any questions, I'll be more than happy to try and answer. I put you all to sleep, didn't I?
The Bombay, the Buren, the Farronville, the Cowdroy, the Exploits, the Glenwood, the Ascension, the Ferryland, the Torpassi, which one is missing?
You're not asking me, are you? You ask him. Ask him. Which one's missing, Morris? I use my typical top out. The Newfoundland is not much better. Rolling game. Well, there you go. There's the 10. Okay. Let me reiterate, that the registries for all of those vessels are available. They're not in the Maritime History Archive, but they are available down the Sir Humphrey Gilbert building. You can certainly do something with them. As you're planning an exhibit, there's no problem to get these registries copies. Yes, sir.
Besides things such as documents, do you have things like photographs and like that as well?
Yeah, again, the people tend to specialize more and more. The Maritime History Archive has about 7,500 photographs. When people donate photographs, I'm in a sort of unique position to know this because I'm on the advisory board of the archive, but also because my wife is in charge of the still and moving images collection at the Provincial Archive. So I sort of see it from both sides. Between one of those two places, you'll find sources, or you'll find a lot of pictures. Again, Morrissey is poked around the edges of it. Let me mention one other source. All right, Morrissey mentioned, and I didn't talk about this tonight. Obviously.
Yes, Dr. Fisher, before you go here, I have a small token of our appreciation. There's a quick story behind this one. Chimel Shipping Company, years ago, when they used to work cargo, they used to give the boys a bit of cargo pay, and they'd always give them a nice pewter mug. And myself and my late father worked on the same vessel in 1972. And of course, this one has got the house flag of Chimel Shipping. It's got Chimel 1972. It doesn't have any other wording, because when the guy came from the office to see what the boys wanted printed on their mugs in Montreal, of course the boys were all gone ashore to Bible classes or whatever, you see. So I took it over yesterday and I had it suitably engraved, Skip Fisher, Newfoundland Coasters, 95. And I think my late father would have loved to have been here tonight to listen to your extremely interesting lecture, and we hope we see more of you in the future. Thank you very much, sir. And ladies and gentlemen, I'm sure we'll have more of these forums as time goes along, and again I'd like to thank Captain Brian O'Neill as a representative of the Marine Institute for coming out, and Johnny Hottenhammer, and our good friend Lou Windsor. Without an engineer we wouldn't get her clear the wharf at all. And so I think that's about it for this meeting. I don't suppose I'll tell you one quick little story before we close. There's a friend of ours in the marine insurance business. You all know him, and most of you are quite aware of him. There's a fellow named Carl Windsor, and Carl, of course, loved boats and ships, and you go in his office and he's got pictures all over the place, although he does other types of insurance as well. And anyways, one time there was a schooner coming up in the 60s when the Labrador fishery was still good. There was a small vessel called the Clara Hallett. And there was a guy from Fair Island that owned her, a good friend of mine, and she was coming up, and the fishery was still good. It must have been around 64, 65, and she had a log load of salt bulk fish just coming over across Bonavista Bay in a worst kind of a southwesterly gale. This is not a very good wind coming across around the Cape and across Trinity Bay. And anyways, unknown to the skipper of this vessel, Carl Windsor was taking the underwriter from Lloyd's of London. Carl was taking them out for a drive, and they were down looking at the lighthouse. And anyway, this poor Englishman looked out, and he saw this little old vessel coming over, no load line on a vessel under 150 tons, under 150, deck in the water, and the worst kind of a day. And he looked out, and he said, "The bleeding bastards." He said, "Who? In tarnation?" He said, "Who?" And he couldn't figure out, and he said, "Who would take such a risk?" And well, he went on and on about how they were going to ruin Lloyd's of London and the underwriters. And of course, poor old Carol was crawling under the desk by this time, because unknown to this gentleman, he was the fellow that had her covered. And Carl, of course, was his representative, and he was crouching, trying to change the topic all the way back to Bonavista, or back to Clarenville, and this fellow kept coming back to who in tarnation would take such a risk. But anyways, it's one of those stories that I remembered. And again, we'd like to thank our guest, Dr. Fisher, and I'd like to thank Captain Morrissey Johnson, who's done some excellent work for this organization. I'm sure you'll be hearing more from Captain Johnson and Captain Croak and Cyril Courtney and the rest of us. And again, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for coming out this evening.